When the New York City pause began on March 22nd, 2020, I, like many white-collar workers, stayed home. The New York public libraries closed. My office at the university was closed. The university libraries were closed. Even the coffee shops where I regularly go to write, think, and recaffeinate were closed. My children's school closed. My partner's co-working space closed. We were all home, bouncing off the walls of our 700 square foot two-bedroom apartment. Drowning in domesticity, I began to fantasize about what the cool lesbians were doing. I imagined that they were regulars at a speakeasy somewhere, probably in Bushwick, where bodies sporting post-apocalyptic fashion and homemade masks could bump and grind on the dance floor. Short, stocky bull dykes would lean against the walls, dressed in double denim, bandanas around their faces like bandits, their eyes on the shifting crowd. Conversation in this fantasy dyke bar is, of course, practically impossible, impeded by face masks and rendered irrelevant by the volume of the music. But the crowds are not there to talk. They're there to see and be seen, to touch their bodies against strangers, and most of all, to dance. The sore point of this imagined utopia was not my omission from the lists of the initiated, but rather the seeming impossibility of its existence and its suspect desirability. Overshadowing the dangers of anti-gay violence or date rape is the shadow of the virus, which has recast the casual intimacy of affinity as reckless endangerment, not only of the self, but of all those we might meet, infect, and damage through a desire for connection. One of the paradoxes of this pandemic is that the societal behaviors which, under regular circumstances, make a community strongest, are now those that render it more vulnerable: intimacy, proximity, intergenerational contact. Not coincidentally, live musical performance and practice, particularly choral singing, has been identified as one of the riskiest activities, with outbreaks linked to choir rehearsals and church services in Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, the US, and South Korea. In the Netherlands, more than 100 choristers became ill after a single concert. In Seattle, a documented superspreader at choir practice left 52 out of 61 participants infected with COVID-19. 2 people died. Few queers are headed out to a dance party, a concert, or rehearsal under such circumstances. Yet after the callous murder of George Floyd was captured on video on May 25th, circulated online, flooding social media, which had no real life or capitalist economy to distract the viewer, New Yorkers, queer, black, and otherwise, found a reason to gather, to see and be seen, flooding into streets day after day to declare with voice and bodily presence that Black Lives Matter. Silence equals death. This is a lesson that we learned during the last plague, or, to cite a version I saw most recently on a repurposed Amazon box, white silence equals white violence. If logically, theoretically, the pause was intended as a selfless and communal action to flatten the curve and reduce the numbers of the ill to levels manageable by the strained medical facilities of a huge city, it didn't feel like it. Instead, the retreat from civic life felt like a selfish act, as wealthy New Yorkers with second homes fled the city. Those who could afford to stockpiled food, toilet paper, and personal protective equipment. Nuclear families were shut into their own private bubbles. Here, Queerantine has thrown into relief the fault lines of US social geography. Some have seen the shutdown as an opportunity for self-improvement, getting buff, learning a new language, or writing the great novel they'd always meant to write. This is much like Boccaccio with the Decameron, a medieval story collection conceived and written during the Black Death epidemic of 1348. The plot hinges on a group of 10 young Florentinian nobles who have escaped to a secluded villa outside the city where they while away their quarantine evenings with stories, songs, and conversation. Yet it is worth dwelling on precisely who gets to be creative under such circumstances, It is not parents or caregivers, particularly female-identified parents, as the labour of childcare is returned directly to the maternal threshold. Nor is it the largely female and of-colour workforce whose labour has been deemed essential. Mail carriers, nurses, public transport workers, teachers, and grocery clerks. As domestic abuse victims are shut in with the perpetrators and the laughably unlevel playing field of education is folded back into hereditary and racialized class privilege, we might all wish for the luxury of boredom. We cannot disentangle the COVID-19 crisis, including deaths, illness, and economic devastation, from the communal response to George Floyd's death. Structural racism is a pre-existing condition, affecting the health outcomes for many people of colour and affecting the racial distribution of low-wage essential workers who cannot shelter in place. The French philosopher Michel Foucault famously observed that the Enlightenment involved a shift from sovereignty to biopower, in which the sovereign right to put someone to death or let them live shifted to a power to keep someone alive through access to clean water, good food, healthcare, or to leave them die through callous structural neglect. In George Floyd's death, we see both mechanisms at play. When Derek Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he arrogated the sovereign power of white supremacism to take a life with impunity, overlaying this act on the racialized biopower that marked Floyd as suspicious in the first place. I do not think it coincidental that George Floyd's dead body tested positive for the coronavirus. The current outpouring of black grief, white guilt, and shared anger has left many musicians asking what they can do to help or show their support. Some suggestions have included blacking out their social media presence or reframing their performances. These are largely the wrong answers to a misplaced question, particularly for classical musicians who have, in insidious ways, been part of the problem. The way to support Black Lives Matter protests is not to play music, it is to get out and protest. Anything else is to effectively continue with business as usual, decorated with a band-aid of virtue signaling. This is not to say that there is no place for music in the fight for civil rights, but that it rarely takes the form of a concert. There is a large literature on music and protest. I encourage you to read it. More surprisingly, perhaps, there is a small but significant literature on music and the plague. In medieval and early modern Europe, moderate and light-hearted musical performance was thought to prevent infection, along with a healthy dose of social distancing and some fresh air. In a plague treatise from 1550, the Italian physician Niccolò Massa recommended that it is especially advantageous to listen to songs and lovely instrumental music, and to play now and then, and to sing with a quiet voice. In 1576, Tommaso del Garbo suggested, spend time in your house, but not with too many people, and make use of songs and music and other pleasurable tales without tiring yourselves out, and all the delightful things that bring anyone comfort. These rather sensible injunctions to shelter in place, however, regularly gave way to more collective action and a feverish need to do something, to correct sinful behaviors, and for the community as a whole to dedicate themselves to the right and to the good. In Italy, local bishops and urban legend coagulated around specific plague saints, and with parades through the city, the populace would dedicate themselves to God and to sanctified behavior, singing psalms and carrying relics. The Met Museum up on Fifth Avenue has a beautiful painting by Van Dyck of Saint Rosalie interceding for the plague-stricken of Palermo, painted while the artist was quarantining during an epidemic in 1624. There is a similar fervour in the Black Lives Matter protests that fill our modern city streets. In their cry for justice and significant reform, and a focus on the martyrs who have died, often grisly deaths, for no fault of their own. The queerly beloved Saint Sebastian was particularly adept at curing the plague. Social justice is the new morality. The protesters are the devout who lay their lives on the line, marching out into the infected city to save us all. And it is here, perhaps, that music does have its place, for the affective force of religious devotion is highly reliant on music as a means to nurture a collective and communal sentiment, singing and playing together in all the intimate, proximate, resonant glory of organized sound. I am reminded of when President Barack Obama sang Amazing Grace at the funeral of Reverend Clementa Pinckney, yet another black man murdered by a white supremacist. By singing, President Obama called attention to the materiality of his voice and to the vulnerability of an idealistic individual looking to create lines of community and affective fervor, working towards justice and hoping for solace. His singing was more powerful because he did it pretty badly. His was a fallible voice that nonetheless took action, empowering others to join him. We all need to take action. It is not enough for us to get back to normal, for normal was largely untenable. We need to reimagine the future as something better, fairer, more equitable. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. Was grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that